Hello, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's begin. Get comfortable and relax. It was early spring of 2019, and I was working a long, tiring job in Salt Lake City. I was 32 then, feeling worn down and craving silence, something real and untouched by noise and crowds. I wanted a break from everything. No people, no emails, no phone calls, just me and nature. So I rented a small off-glass cabin out near the edge of the Uinta Mountains, about 2 hours from the city, where the forest was thick and the roads turned rough and dusty. The cabin was pretty remote, perched on a slope with a wide, low-hanging glass window looking out into a dense patch of pines and firs. The glass was smudged and slightly foggy, but it gave a clear enough view of the woods and the small creek that ran past not far from the porch. When I arrived, it was late afternoon and the sun was just starting to dip behind the trees, painting everything in dull gold and shadow. The cabin looked simple but sturdy, wooden logs stacked and sealed with moss and resin, a thin metal chimney poking through the slanted roof, and a heavy, creaky door that I had to slam shut behind me to keep the cold air out. Inside, there was a small wood stove, a tiny kitchen corner with a sink and some shelves, a folding table and chair, and a single cot with a thin mattress. There was no electricity except for a single solar panel outside, and no running water except the creek. The whole place smelled faintly of old pine and dry wood smoke, with a hint of dampness lingering in the corners. I unpacked my stuff slowly, setting up the essentials: a lantern, canned food, water bottles, a first aid kit, a knife, and my sleeping bag. I wanted to be prepared because the nearest town was miles away, and my phone barely got any signal. I spent the first night reading by the lantern's dim light, the quiet outside pressing against the thin glass like something waiting. I kept the door locked and a small hatchet close by. The wind rustled the branches, and sometimes an animal's call echoed faintly in the dark. I told myself it was nothing, just the forest alive and breathing. But even then, I couldn't shake a subtle feeling, like eyes watching from the shadows. The next day, I hiked a little around the area. The woods were dense, the ground soft with moss and pine needles. I saw deer tracks near the creek and some scattered bird feathers on the ground. I collected a few dry branches for the stove and explored the narrow dirt path that led downhill to a forgotten dirt road. The isolation was peaceful but heavy, like the silence had weight. That evening, I made a fire, the flames throwing tall shadows against the cabin walls. Outside, the stars were bright and countless. It was the third day that things started to change. I woke just before dawn to a faint noise, like footsteps crunching softly on dry leaves outside. I stayed frozen, listening. The cabin's big glass window faced the woods, and through the blurry pane, I could just make out dark shapes moving between the trees. I told myself it must be an animal, maybe a deer or a wild boar passing through. But the footsteps were slow, careful, deliberate, almost like someone was watching the cabin, moving just out of sight. I waited until the noise stopped, then got up and peered outside. The air was cold and thick with fog curling around the tree trunks. There was nothing there, no footprints, no signs of passage. It was as if whoever or whatever had been there vanished into the mist. I told myself not to overthink it and tried to go back to sleep, but the feeling lingered, crawling under my skin. Later that morning, while making coffee, I heard a low, slow tapping at the window. It was faint but steady, like someone knocking. My heart jumped, and I grabbed the small hatchet from the table and walked carefully to the window. Outside was only the thick forest and some broken branches, but no one. The tapping stopped. I pressed my palm to the cold glass and stared into the empty trees. I could almost swear I saw a shadow move behind a pine. My skin prickled and I stepped back. For the rest of the day, I stayed close to the cabin, piling wood for the stove and keeping my knife handy. I thought about leaving, but the road back was rough and the sky was already turning gray with an early storm brewing. I didn't want to drive back in rain on a dirt road I barely knew. That night, the storm came in full force. Rain hammered the roof and windows. Wind howled through the trees and the cabin shuddered with every gust. The power of the storm was almost hypnotic, and I sat by the fire, trying to keep calm. But the tapping returned, this time more insistent, louder, and irregular, as if someone was trying to get my attention. I wanted to believe it was just a branch or the wind, but the rhythm felt human, intentional. I gripped the hatchet tightly and sat frozen, listening. Suddenly, through the glass, a figure appeared. A man standing just beyond the clearing, soaked by the rain, face half hidden under a dark hood. His eyes caught the dim light from inside the cabin, and he stared straight at me. The rain ran down his face, and he didn't move or speak. He just stood there, cold and silent. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to yell, to call out, but no words came. The storm roared around us, but inside the cabin, time froze. I saw his hand twitch near his jacket pocket, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but I felt raw danger. He vanished as suddenly as he appeared, slipping back into the shadows. My heart pounded, and I locked all the doors and windows, blocking every opening with whatever I could find. The rain kept falling, but I didn't dare look outside again. I stayed awake, clutching the hatchet until dawn. The next morning, the storm cleared. The forest looked peaceful again, washed clean by rain and sunlight. I stepped outside cautiously. There were no footprints, no signs the man had been there, except for some broken branches and a few small patches of disturbed dirt near the cabin. The place felt empty, but wrong. I packed up my things and drove back slowly, glancing in the rearview mirror every few minutes. The fear stayed with me for weeks afterward, a heavy weight in my chest whenever I closed my eyes. I never reported it, never told anyone, because I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it all. But the memory of that man standing in the rain, watching me through the glass, real, silent, and dangerous, never left. I never went back to that cabin or the Uinta Mountains. Sometimes when the wind blows just right and the sky turns gray, I swear I can still feel those cold eyes on me, waiting somewhere just beyond the trees. It was late October 1998 when I took the job as a seasonal park ranger in the vast Bitterroot National Forest, Montana. I was 26 years old, fresh out of college with a degree in forestry and wildlife management. I had grown up near the city, but I always craved the quiet and wide open spaces of the wilderness. The forest was famous for its rugged terrain, dense pine trees, and deep valleys carved by the winding Bitterroot River. My position was simple: patrol the backcountry, check on hikers, monitor wildlife activity, and keep an eye out for any fires or signs of illegal hunting. The Park Service provided me with a small rustic cabin near the edge of a clearing called Dead Man's Hollow, about 6 miles in from the main ranger station. The cabin was old, built in the 1940s, but solid and cozy. It had a wood stove, a small bunk bed, a table with a chair, and just enough room to store some food and gear. I arrived at the cabin on a chilly afternoon after a long hike from the ranger station. The trees around were tall and thick, their orange and red leaves rustling softly in the wind. The air smelled like pine needles and earth, damp but clean. There was no cell signal here, just the silence of the forest and the occasional chirp of birds preparing for winter. It was perfect. My first few days went smoothly. I followed the forest trails, checking on campsites, collecting reports from hikers who stopped by the station, and making sure the fire risk was low. The forest was quiet and still, except for the sounds of nature. I had my dog Scout with me, a medium-sized shepherd mix who was loyal and alert. Scout and I made a good team, and the days felt peaceful. On the fourth night, things started to change. I had just finished cooking dinner. A simple stew warmed on the wood stove and was sitting by the window when I noticed something unusual. A set of faint footprints outside the cabin door, pressed into the damp earth and leaves. I hadn't heard any sounds, but the prints were there, fresh. They were too large for Scout and seemed to come from a heavy boot. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The moon was just a thin crescent, barely lighting the clearing. I swept the beam across the forest edge, but saw nothing. The footprints led toward the tree line, then vanished into the darkness. I felt a chill run down my spine. No one was supposed to be out here at night. I double-checked my supplies, locked the door, and stayed awake for hours, sitting by the stove with Scout close. Nothing else happened that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next day, I hiked along the main trail near Dead Man's Hollow. The forest was calm, but dense, and the trees blocked most of the sunlight. I kept an eye on the ground, looking for more signs of someone else. About 2 miles from the cabin, I found a small campsite, freshly made, with a fire pit still warm, and a few pieces of trash left behind. No people in sight. I called it in on my radio, but the signal was weak, and I barely got through to the ranger station. They said they'd send someone out soon, but it might take a while. I was alone with only Scout and the forest around me. That night, the feeling of unease grew stronger. I heard faint noises in the distance, twigs snapping, leaves crunching, a low, steady sound like footsteps circling the cabin. Scout growled softly, his fur standing on end. I grabbed my hunting knife and flashlight, moving quietly to the windows, shining the light out into the dark. Suddenly, a shadow darted between the trees, quick and silent. I aimed my flashlight there, but the figure was gone. My heart pounded. Who was out here? Hunters? Trespassers? Someone lost? The rest of the night was tense but uneventful. I made sure to keep the fire stove going for warmth and light, hoping the glow would keep anyone at bay. The following morning, I found more footprints around the cabin this time, and marks on the back door where someone had tried to pry it open. The metal latch was bent, but still held. Whoever had been here was bold or desperate. I knew I couldn't stay here alone much longer. I packed my gear carefully, ready to hike back to the station. But as I stepped outside, Scout froze. His ears were pinned back, growling low, eyes fixed on the tree line. Then I saw him, a man, tall and thin, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. He was watching me from the edge of the forest, half hidden by the trees. His eyes reflected the morning light like cold steel. I didn't recognize him, and he didn't say anything, just stood there unmoving. I held up my hand to show I meant no harm, but he didn't respond. Slowly, I backed away toward the trail, keeping my eyes on him. Scout stayed close, barking sharply. The man stepped back into the trees and vanished. I hurried along the trail without stopping. My radio crackled faintly, and I called the station, asking for help. They promised to send a backup ranger with a vehicle by nightfall. That day, I stayed on the move, not daring to rest. The forest felt hostile now, every shadow suspicious, every sound unnerving. I kept my knife ready, my flashlight charged, and Scout alert. As night fell, I reached a small clearing with a makeshift wooden platform. The ranger backup was there, a grizzled man named Tom who'd been working the forest for 20 years. He loaded my gear into his truck, and we drove back to the main station. I reported everything I had seen and found. Tom said the man I'd seen was likely an illegal hunter or someone hiding from the law. The forest was known for attracting desperate people, especially as winter approached. They searched the area after, but found no trace. Back at the station, I felt relief wash over me. The forest was still wild and unpredictable, but with other people around, it seemed less threatening. I realized that nature wasn't just beautiful, it could be dangerous, especially when humans with bad intentions entered it. The experience stayed with me for years. I never forgot the quiet terror of those nights, the feeling of being watched and hunted, but I also learned the value of vigilance and respect for the wilderness. Eventually, I left the park ranger job for a desk position, but I still think about that cabin in the pines, about the silence that hides so much and the dangers that come not from ghosts or monsters, but from people and the wild itself. It was late October of 2019 when I finally got around to building the small cabin I'd been talking about for years. I was 36 then, single, no kids, and working remotely as a freelance CAD draftsman. I'd bought 5 acres of sloped woodland up in eastern Kentucky near Stanton, not far from the Red River Gorge, maybe 2 hours from Lexington. The land wasn't anything special, a mix of second-growth trees, rocky clay soil, and more ticks than I'd like to admit, but it was mine. And the ridge on the back corner overlooked a deep hollow that stayed foggy well into the morning. That view was what sold me. I cleared a small space on the ridge earlier that spring with a chainsaw and a brush axe, dragged out stumps with a winch and handle, leveled the slope with a pick and shovel over 3 long weekends. I'd even dug out a shallow foundation and laid concrete pier blocks on gravel I hauled in from the road in 5-gallon buckets. It was slow work. I wanted to build it alone. I don't know why. Probably something stubborn in me. I told my coworkers it was about the satisfaction of doing it with my own hands. But if I'm honest, I think it had more to do with not wanting to owe anyone anything. By the time I got around to building, the weather was turning. That weekend was supposed to be clear. It wasn't. I arrived Friday morning in my Tacoma with a bed full of lumber and tools, and it was already drizzling. The forecast showed it clearing up by evening, but clouds clung low to the ridge like wet blankets, and the air smelled like copper and dirt. I parked down the slope and carried everything up by hand. 2x6 floor joists, 4x4 posts, sheets of OSB, and a bundle of metal roofing panels. The cabin was small, 10 by 12 feet, just enough room for a cot, a small wood stove, and a little table. It wasn't meant to be lived in full time, just a place to get away and be quiet. By the time I got the floor frame built, it was nearly dark and the rain had picked up. I didn't bring a tent. I'd figured I'd be able to throw the frame together and sleep under a tarp strung across the posts. I'd done worse, but by 9 p.m. I was soaked through and shivering. My hands were blistered from hammering brackets and screwing down subfloor in the cold. I remember kneeling on the OSB floor, water dripping from my hood, staring out at the fog swirling through the trees. I hadn't seen a single person since I turned off the county road that morning. Not even a car, just the rain and the low hush of wind moving through wet leaves. It was the kind of quiet that makes you hear things. Every creak of a tree, every rustle in the brush, every drop of water slipping from leaf to ground. I laid out a tarp and crawled into my sleeping bag, fully dressed with my boots still on. The ridgeline was muddy and uneven, and water pulled at the corners of the subfloor, collecting in shallow puddles. It was a long night. I slept in fits, waking often to the sound of branches snapping in the dark or the thump of something hitting the plywood floor near my head. Once I thought I heard footsteps, but it could have been water dripping from a broken branch. I told myself that at least I had a handgun with me. A 9mm I kept in the glove box and rarely used. I'd brought it up to the site before dark, left it wrapped in a towel under the stack of roofing sheets. Around midnight, I pulled it into the sleeping bag with me, just in case. When the sun finally rose, the fog didn't lift. It just got brighter, like someone had turned up a dim light behind a curtain. I forced myself up, made instant coffee on my camp stove, and chewed a cold granola bar. My fingers were numb. My jeans were soaked. I almost packed it all up and left, but I didn't. I told myself I'd get the walls up and the roof on that day, no matter what. That Saturday, the rain came in heavy bursts. I framed the walls with 2x4s and secured them with metal hurricane ties, but the wind was strong enough to knock them sideways before I could brace them. Twice I had to re-square the corners after a gust tipped everything just as I went to grab another board. My fingers kept slipping on wet screws. I dropped my drill 3 times. At one point, I screamed into the trees, just frustration, but the sound came out weak and hollow like it didn't want to be heard. That afternoon, while I was nailing the last wall in place, I heard something in the woods. Not wind, not a deer, something heavier, slow, deliberate. I froze, nail halfway driven, and listened. The sound stopped. I waited a long minute, heart pounding. I'm not a paranoid person. I don't believe in monsters or any of that nonsense. But when you're alone in the woods, soaked to the bone, and hear something big move through brush less than 30 feet away, your brain starts making all kinds of calculations. I stepped off the floor and walked the edge of the ridge, looking down through the trees. It was steep, muddy, and choked with brambles. Nothing moved, just the rain. Then I saw something. Not a person, not an animal, just the edge of something dark. Dark enough to stand out against the gray-green undergrowth. Maybe a piece of old tarp or a shadow. I stood there staring until the wind shifted and a gust of rain smacked me in the face. When I looked again, it was gone. I told myself it was nothing. Probably was, but I worked faster after that. By sundown, I had all 4 walls up and most of the roof framed. The OSB sheathing wasn't on yet, but it was enough to keep out the worst of the rain. I nailed tarps across the gaps and hunkered inside for the night, eating a cold can of beans and watching the forest through the open roof. That second night was worse. The wind shook the walls. Rain blew in sideways, stinging my face where I lay curled in the sleeping bag. I was so tired, I started dreaming with my eyes open, seeing things move in the trees, imagining voices under the wind. At one point, I thought I saw a man standing at the edge of the ridge, facing me, still a stone, but I didn't move. Couldn't. I just watched until he wasn't there anymore. When dawn came, I was already awake. I hadn't slept more than an hour. My face felt raw. My back ached. My wrists were swollen from the hammer and cold. But I got up, made coffee again. This time I poured the boiling water into my gloves just to warm them up. I got the roof panels on that day. They were slick and sharp-edged, and I cut my palm on one while dragging it up. Blood mixed with rain on the plywood. I wrapped it with duct tape and kept working. Sometime around 3 p.m., I was crouched behind the cabin, cutting a board for the back brace when I heard it again. That movement, that slow, deliberate shifting of weight on wet leaves. I stood and turned fast, drill in one hand again. Nothing. But I knew I wasn't imagining it. I walked down the ridge this time. About 20 feet in, I found a boot print in the mud. Human? Too big to be mine. It wasn't fresh, maybe from Friday, but I hadn't seen it before. I walked further down about 30 yards and found a pile of brush that looked like it had been used as a blind. Small logs leaned against a rock, forming a kind of half shelter, just high enough to crouch inside. There were food wrappers, crumpled bags of jerky, an old Mountain Dew bottle, and a small pile of cigarette butts. None of it was more than a few days old. I didn't like the feeling that crawled up my neck. Someone had been watching the ridge. Maybe still was. I walked back to the cabin, slower now, scanning the trees. The rain was lighter but steady. I kept the drill in one hand and the 9mm tucked into my belt. The last thing I did that day was screw a scrap of OSB across the door opening and bolt it from the inside. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little safer. I didn't sleep that night, just sat with my back against the wall, the pistol in my lap, listening to the rain tap the metal roof like fingers. At one point, just after midnight, I heard something hit the wall behind me. Not hard, just a soft thud. I waited 10 minutes before I moved. Stepped outside barefoot, gun in hand. There was nothing. But when I walked around to the back wall, I found a rock sitting in the mud, round, the size of a baseball. I hadn't seen it there before. I didn't go back inside. I stayed out the rest of the night, pacing, listening, waiting. When morning came, I packed up fast, left the roofing tools, the scrap wood, even the folding chair. Just threw my gear in the truck and drove down the slope without even checking my mirrors. I came back 2 weeks later with a friend from work. He carried a .22 rifle and didn't say much when I showed him the boot print and the blind. We tore it apart and burned it in a steel drum. I finished the cabin in silence. Now it stands there at the edge of the ridge, dry and solid with a steel door and a padlock. I visit sometimes, sit inside and drink coffee on rainy days. I bring a sleeping bag but never stay the night. I don't know who was out there. Probably some drifter, maybe a hunter squatting on private land. Nothing ever came of it, but I remember how it felt. That cold, wet silence, that sense of being watched, of not being alone. It's why I built the cabin, but it's also why I don't sleep there. Not anymore. It was late October 2016, and I had just come off a rough few months working long hours at a freight warehouse in Cardiff. I was 34 at the time. I'd been there nearly a decade, mostly loading and unloading trucks, sometimes doing overnight shifts depending on demand. After back-to-back weeks of 60-hour shifts, I told my manager I needed some time. My back hurt constantly. I was barely sleeping, and I was snappy even around my own family. So I booked 4 days off and decided to get away from everything, somewhere quiet, somewhere without anyone. I went online and started browsing private rentals up in the Midlands. I didn't want a hotel or a campsite with families around me. I needed total stillness. I ended up finding a small private cabin listed by some retired guy about 20 minutes outside a village called Allersley. That's in Warwickshire. I'd never been up that way before, but the place looked isolated enough. Sat in a patch of private woodland down a gravel road with no nearby houses. It didn't even have Wi-Fi or phone signal, which was exactly what I wanted. Total switch off. The pictures showed a basic timber structure with a small porch, wood-burning stove, and a cleared-out patch in the woods with a fire pit. No neighbors, no traffic, just trees and quiet. I paid in full that same night. The man who owned it, someone named Mr. Hoyd, sent me a confirmation email with an attached PDF of directions because GPS wouldn't help out there. I printed it, packed my bags, loaded up the boot of my old Honda, and hit the road the next afternoon. I left Cardiff around 2:30 p.m. Traffic through the city wasn't too bad. Once I got into rural England, it felt like I could breathe for the first time in months. Rolling fields, winding roads, even the weather had turned mild. There was a smell in the air like old wood and damp leaves. After turning off the main road, I followed Hoyd's directions down a narrow track with overgrown hedges on both sides. The gravel crackled under my tires. I slowed down to a crawl and watched for the markers he mentioned. A bent metal gate, an old tree stump shaped like a fork, a faded white arrow nailed to a fence post. Eventually, I found the turnoff to the cabin. It was smaller than I expected. The photos hadn't really shown scale. It looked like something built decades ago, maybe post-war, with dark, weather-stained timber walls and moss growing around the base, but it had character. I parked in the clearing and stepped out. Everything was dead quiet. Not a single car, voice, or bird. I remember standing there for a moment, just listening to the silence. It was like the trees were holding their breath. I unlocked the cabin door and stepped inside. Smelled old, but not in a bad way, like dried pine and a hint of ash. The furniture was basic, a single bed against the wall, an old armchair beside a wood stove, a kitchenette with a gas hob, and a battered kettle. There was one window in the back looking out toward the woods. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some pasta on the hob, read a bit from a book I brought, and tried to clear my mind. Around 9, I stepped outside to pee. No lights, no moon, just the black outline of trees against a sky scattered with stars. I stood there for a few minutes, taking it in. It was cold, and I could hear the wind pressing through the leaves like a distant whisper. I went back inside, shut the door, locked it, and turned in early. Next day, I woke up around 7 a.m., a bit stiff, but rested. I made tea, took a short walk through the trees behind the cabin, and sat on the porch for most of the morning, doing nothing. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in years. Around midday, I noticed clouds rolling in. The air smelled heavier. I could tell a storm was coming. That afternoon, the rain started. First, just a soft patter, then a steady drumming on the roof. I stayed inside, made some instant soup, and listened to the weather. Around 5 p.m., I heard what sounded like footsteps outside. Not walking, but a shuffle, like someone dragging a foot through wet leaves. I paused. The wind had picked up by then, and I told myself it was probably a branch falling or some animal nosing through the undergrowth. Still, I went to the back window and looked out. I couldn't see much, just streaks of rain and the blur of trees. I kept watching. Nothing moved. I waited a few minutes longer, then let it go. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The wind rattled the cabin walls, and the stove kept ticking as it cooled. I pulled the blankets tighter and shut my eyes, but my ears stayed alert. Just as I started drifting off, I heard something again, a soft creak. This time it wasn't outside, came from the front porch. I froze. My heart started racing. I waited. The rain was still falling. I heard the creak again, would underweight like someone standing on the edge of the porch, shifting their position. I stayed still for what felt like half an hour. Eventually, I got up, walked quietly across the floor, and looked through the peephole in the door. Nothing. I exhaled slowly. Maybe it was the wind again. Maybe the old boards just shifted under the pressure. I went back to bed, but my sleep was light and uneasy. The third day was worse. I spent most of the morning inside because the rain hadn't stopped. Around noon, I went out to collect some firewood from the small stack on the side of the cabin. That's when I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the mud. At first, I thought they were mine, but they were smaller, more narrow, and definitely barefoot. They led from the tree line straight toward the cabin. They stopped at the edge of the porch. I stared at them, feeling something cold crawl up my spine. I hadn't seen or heard anyone. There were no houses nearby. The nearest village was over 10 miles away. I followed the prints back toward the trees. About 10 feet in, they vanished, just disappeared into the underbrush like whoever made them had suddenly stepped sideways into the trees. I went back inside, locked the door, and didn't go out again for hours. Around 4 p.m., I started the stove early. I needed the warmth, but I also needed the comfort. I kept glancing at the windows like a nervous animal. As the evening fell, I made some tea and sat near the fire, staring into the flames. That's when I heard it again. The creak. This time it was longer, heavier, like someone standing full weight on the porch, shifting back and forth. I stood up and moved to the door. Slowly, I didn't open it, just stood behind it, listening. Rain tapped the roof, wind hissed through the cracks. And then I heard it, a breath, not mine, soft and ragged on the other side of the door. I stepped back, heart hammering. I grabbed the fire poker from beside the stove and stood there, holding it tight. The breathing stopped. I waited. No knock, no words, just silence. After 10 minutes, I moved back to the peephole and looked out, and I saw her, a woman standing at the edge of the trees. Pale skin, thin frame, long wet hair hanging over her face. She wasn't wearing shoes, just a dark dress soaked from the rain clinging to her legs. She wasn't moving, just staring at the cabin. I stepped back. My chest was tight. I didn't know what to do. She stood there for maybe 2 minutes. Then, without a sound, she turned and walked into the woods. Not fast, just slow, like she wasn't in any kind of hurry. I locked the door again, reinforced it with the small table from the corner, and didn't sleep at all that night. Every time the wind groaned or the fire shifted, I flinched. When dawn broke, I was already packed. I left the stove cold. Didn't even clean up my things. Just shoved everything in my bags and got out. The gravel road was slick from the rain, but I didn't care. I drove with white knuckles until I hit the main road again. Back in Cardiff, I emailed Mr. Hoyt and told him I left early. I didn't go into details. He replied 2 days later thanking me and hoping I had enjoyed the peace and quiet. I didn't respond. I told my brother what happened, just the basics. Strange sounds, someone walking past. He laughed and told me I was probably just jumpy, paranoid from being alone. But it wasn't paranoia. I know what I saw. Weeks later, I still thought about that woman. Her face was mostly hidden by her hair, but there was something in the way she stood, not lost, not scared, just still watching. I looked into the area around Allersley online, wondering if there had been incidents. Nothing came up. No missing persons, no strange reports, no local gossip. It was like nothing had ever happened, but someone was there. I don't go on solo trips anymore. Not out in the woods, not off the grid. I stick to hotels, cities, places with cameras and people. I never saw her again, but I think about her more than I'd like to admit. How she stood barefoot in the mud, not saying a word, like she belonged there more than I ever could. And I still wonder what would have happened if I'd opened the door. It was the fall of 2016, late September, and I remember the air already had that early bite of cold that hit the back of your throat when you breathe too deep. I had been working long hours as a technician for a concrete company in Portland, and I needed a break. My name's Logan. I was 34 at the time, still single, no kids, just a couple of close friends who were all busy that weekend. I had some unused PTO hours stacked up. So I decided to take a solo trip up north to a remote cabin near Mount Adams, Washington. I had rented the place through an older, less-known website, kind of like a Craigslist clone that focused on cabin rentals and hunting lodges. The ad didn't have many pictures, but the price was low, and the owner said it was quiet and away from the world. That was all I needed to hear. It was a 4-hour drive up from Portland. I left just before noon on a Friday. Traffic wasn't bad, and once I passed Trout Lake, I was mostly on dirt roads winding into the forest. There were fewer and fewer homes the deeper I got, until it was nothing but trees and occasional gates with faded paint. The road narrowed, twisting hard, and the ruts were deep from years of wear. My old Toyota Tacoma handled it fine. I stopped a few times to double-check I was still going the right way. The cabin sat just off a bend in a gravel path behind a wooden gate with a chain that had no lock. It looked like no one had been there for a long time. The ground had thick pine needles covering everything. The roof was metal rusting in spots. There were old window shutters and a porch that sagged a bit on one side, but the door opened clean, and inside was dry and warmer than I expected. There was a propane heater, a small kitchen with an old stove, and a tiny wood-burning fireplace that was cracked but usable. No cell signal. No. I spent the first hour unpacking and walking the perimeter. The land dropped off behind the cabin into a slope that turned into thick woods. There was a trail down to a dry creek bed and some overgrown deer tracks. I saw an old fire pit with beer cans and crushed water bottles from what looked like a long time ago. I didn't plan on doing much, just reading, hiking a bit, and getting some quiet. The air was cold but fresh. The trees swayed slowly and the quiet settled in heavy. That night, I cooked beans on the stove, had a few drinks, and sat on the porch watching the sky get darker than I'd seen in years. The stars looked like they were crawling across the sky. I slept easy, tired from the drive. The second day, Saturday, I got up around 7:30. I boiled some coffee on the stovetop and went for a long walk down the slope behind the cabin. It was steep and thick with brush, and I had to push through tangled branches and vines. I carried a knife and a small pack with water and jerky. I went maybe 3 minutes out and looped back, finding another trail that ran across the slope and eventually led me back behind the cabin. That evening, I sat out again with a blanket and read until I couldn't see the pages. Then I turned in early. That night was the first time I noticed something that didn't sit right. Around 3 a.m., I woke up and didn't know why. No dream, just a jolt awake. Like my body knew something. I lay still, eyes wide open, listening. The cabin made its usual creaks. But beneath that, I heard something faint movement. It wasn't close, not on the porch or anything, but far enough out that it almost blended with the wind in the trees. But it wasn't wind. It was steady, deliberate, like footsteps over dry leaves, slow and quiet. I sat up, listening hard, and after a minute, it stopped. I held still for another hour before falling back asleep, telling myself it was probably a deer. The next morning, I went out and checked the area behind the cabin. The leaves and ground were messy with animal tracks. I found one spot maybe 30 yards down the slope that looked different, like someone had stepped there, and the leaves were pressed down in a heel-to-toe pattern, more boot-like than hoofed. But I didn't know. I told myself I was being paranoid. Sunday, I stayed closer to the cabin. I chopped some of the dry wood stacked under the porch, cleaned the stovetop, and hiked just a short loop near the dry creek. I saw an old trail camera mounted high in a tree, but it was dead. Probably hadn't worked in years. That night, I made soup, kept the fire going longer, and kept my knife closer. Couldn't sleep well. I kept waking up at little sounds, cracking twigs, soft scuffing outside the walls. I told myself it was squirrels, maybe raccoons, but something about the pattern was too slow, too smooth. Around 2:40 a.m., I heard a knock. Just one. Like I froze. It was at the back of the cabin, not the door, not the porch, just the wall. I sat up, heart pounding, and didn't move. I didn't breathe heavy. I just waited. No more sound came. In the morning, I found nothing again. No damage, no markings. But near the corner of the cabin, behind the firewood, the dirt looked like it had been disturbed, like someone had crouched there or stepped there and shifted their weight. I went out with my knife and walked a wider loop around the cabin. No one, nobody, nothing obvious. I had one night left Sunday night, and I didn't plan on running scared. I stayed alert, skipped drinking, and sat by the fire until it burned low. Then I double-checked every window, locked the door with the wooden beam latch, and lay down in the sleeping bag on the old mattress. Started around 1 a.m. this time. First it was just the wind, but then came the same footsteps. Closer this time, not from behind, from the front. Across the gravel, slow I lay still, knife in hand, breathing through my nose. The footsteps stopped at the porch. Boards creaked, soft but sharp. 2 steps, then silence. I thought about yelling, making noise, flipping the lights, but I waited. Nothing happened for over 10 minutes. Then I heard the soft sound of someone crouching. That weight shifting sound where a boot or shoe presses down slightly and shifts the gravel beneath it. Then silence again. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed motionless until the sky started to lighten slightly through the window cracks. Once it was daylight, I got up and stepped outside with the knife. The porch looked normal, but the gravel, someone had definitely stood there. 2 clear boot prints different from mine. Bigger, narrower, and they were pointed at the door, not walking away. I packed everything by 8 a.m., shoved it all in the truck, and didn't waste time. I stopped once at the end of the gravel road to close the gate behind me, and I saw something then that made my chest go cold. On the tree beside the gate, maybe shoulder height, someone had carved a symbol or mark. Not a word, not initials, just a strange shape, like 2 X's overlapping with a vertical slash down the center. It wasn't there when I arrived. I was sure of that. I drove straight back to Portland, didn't stop, didn't eat. I got home, locked up, and sat in silence for over an hour trying to make sense of everything. The next day, I called the number from the rental site, but it was disconnected. The listing had been removed. I emailed the site admins, no response. I tried finding the address through county records, but it wasn't listed under any current owner. It was like the cabin was just there, unofficial, unlisted. 2 weeks later, I got a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single photo. It was a picture of the back of my truck taken at night, taken while it was parked at the cabin. You could just barely make out the license plate and the outline of the pine trees behind it. That was it. No words, no message, just the photo. I moved apartments the next month. I got a better lock, changed my number, and stopped going out to remote places alone. I never figured out who was out there with me or what they wanted. But I know this, it wasn't an animal. It wasn't just a fluke. Someone was watching me that weekend, and whoever it was, they were used to that cabin, used to waiting, and maybe next time they wouldn't just knock. I hadn't been back to the cabin since Mike died. It had been over a year, 14 months to be exact, and I kept telling myself I didn't need anything there. But after the estate paperwork finally cleared, and his sister mailed me the key with a short note saying I could take whatever was still mine, I decided to drive out there. Part of me needed to see it one more time. Not just for closure, but because a few of my things were still scattered around from when I used to stay there before everything between us fell apart. Felt like I needed to draw a final line under it all. Mike and I bought that cabin together in 2012, 2 years before the divorce. It was up in the Catskills, not far from Margaretville, New York. It wasn't big or fancy, just a one-bedroom, wood-paneled structure tucked at the base of a slope, surrounded by pine trees, no neighbors for miles. It had a steep gravel driveway that froze over in winter, a rusted red metal roof, and a porch that looked out over a gully where deer sometimes passed through in the early mornings. Back then, we thought it would be our weekend escape from the city. But like everything else, it became a place where we argued and stopped sleeping in the same bed. When the divorce was finalized in 2014, I left him the cabin. I figured he'd never sell it. He was one of those people who clung to physical places the way some cling to photographs. When he died in December 2017, heart failure, alone in a motel in Utica, I didn't cry. I hadn't spoken to him in years. I only found out a week later when his cousin sent me a Facebook message. I kept thinking about how quiet his life had become, how far he'd drifted from everyone, how the last time I saw him, he looked like someone who'd given up on fixing himself. Anyway, I drove up to the cabin on a Friday morning in early October 2019. I left my apartment in Beacon around 7:30 and reached the driveway just after 10. The sky was dull and gray, the kind of weather where the light seems to get trapped in the clouds. It had rained earlier in the week, so the ground was soft and the gravel sunk beneath my boots as I stepped out of the car. I stood there for a moment, looking up at the structure, feeling the weirdness of being back. The porch had a few leaves scattered across it, but otherwise it looked the same. The windows were shut and the shades were still drawn. The old wind chime I bought in a little antique shop in Phoenicia still hung by the door, though it barely moved in the still air. The screen door creaked, just like I remembered when I pulled it open. I unlocked the front door with the key Sheila sent me and stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Musty, faintly moldy, like wet wood and old clothes. The kind of smell that sticks to your nose. It was cold inside, too. Colder than it was outside, and it made me wrap my coat tighter around myself. The living room was just as we left it years ago. Same furniture, same rug, even the dent in the cushion where Mike used to fall asleep watching TV. There was dust on everything. The coffee table had old magazines still stacked neatly, and a pair of Mike's sunglasses sat right in the center like he'd just stepped out to smoke. The couch was covered in a faded wool blanket I didn't recognize. I walked through each room slowly, trying to remember what was mine. In the bedroom, I found an old flannel shirt of mine still hanging in the closet and a box under the bed that had a few paperback novels I'd brought up here back in 2013. I found a few kitchen items. I remembered ceramic mugs I'd gotten at a street fair, a small cutting board my dad had made years ago, a cast iron pan I loved and missed. I stacked them in a box I'd brought in from the car. By the time I'd finished walking the place, it was almost noon. I opened the windows to let some air in and took a bottle of water outside to sit on the porch. I didn't feel scared. Not exactly, just unsettled. The kind of feeling you get when walking through a space that still holds shadows of someone who's gone. It wasn't grief, just a dull, quiet discomfort. I was about to start bringing the box back to the car when I noticed something weird. The back door, the one that led out to the slope behind the cabin, was unlocked. It was closed, but I could see the latch wasn't set. I hadn't touched it. I was sure of that. I walked over, turned the knob, and it swung open without resistance. The wooden steps leading down the slope were wet and covered in pine needles. I looked around the trees. Nothing. No signs of anyone. Maybe Sheila had been here before sending the key, or maybe Mike had left it unlocked at some point and it just stayed that way. I shut it, locked it this time, and moved on. Around 2, I was in the bedroom packing a few more books when I heard it. Something shifting above me. A soft thump, then another from the attic. The attic was tiny, just a crawl space, really. It was above the bedroom, accessed by a narrow pull-down ladder in the hallway. I froze, stood still for a minute, and listened. Nothing followed, just silence. I told myself it was probably a squirrel or a raccoon. Maybe a branch had fallen. Still, I walked out and stared up at the ceiling where the pull cord for the ladder hung. I didn't want to pull it down. The attic always creeped me out when we used to come here. It was unfinished, filled with insulation and mouse droppings and old junk we hadn't used in years. But I couldn't ignore it. I needed to check it just to be sure. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, one of those long, heavy ones, and yanked the cord. The ladder creaked down slowly, and dust floated into the air. I climbed up one step at a time. The flashlight pointed into the dark space above. I poked my head into the attic and swept the beam left and right. Nothing jumped out at me. No animal, no sudden movement, but someone had definitely been up there. Near the back corner of the attic, there was a sleeping bag laid out on top of a blue tarp. A few empty cans of beans, a plastic water jug, and a small camping stove sat beside it. And next to all that was something that made my stomach twist. A pile of cigarette butts and a torn piece of flannel shirt I recognized. It had belonged to Mike. He used to wear it every fall. I stood there for a long moment, not moving. The dust was thick in the beam of my flashlight, and the air smelled like something had gone stale. I backed down the ladder without touching anything and closed it up again. My first thought was someone had been squatting, probably after Mike died. Maybe a drifter found the cabin empty and used it to sleep. But the place was locked when I arrived. There were no broken windows, no signs of forced entry. The back door had been unlocked. Yes, but not damaged. Still, I didn't feel in danger. Just watched. I took the box of my things and put it in the back of my car. I almost left right then, but something kept me there. I didn't want to drive back down the mountain with that knot in my gut. So I made coffee on the old gas stove, opened a few more windows, and tried to breathe through it. At dusk, I started a small fire in the wood stove, mostly for warmth. The cabin creaked in the wind. I sat on the couch, drinking instant coffee and flipping through an old book. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. And around 7:30, I heard something again, this time outside. Footsteps, slow, crunching leaves. I turned off the light and moved toward the window, heart racing. I crouched beside it and peeked through the gap in the curtain. There was someone out there standing about 20 feet from the porch, half hidden behind a tree. I couldn't see their face, just the shape of a man, tall, lean, wearing a hood or a cap. I didn't move. I waited, breath shallow. He didn't come closer. Didn't call out, just stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a few minutes. Then he turned and walked into the trees. I locked every door and window. I kept the flashlight with me at all times and sat in the living room wide awake until at least 2 a.m. No sleep. Every noise outside made me freeze. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. But he didn't come back. By sunrise, I'd made up my mind. I didn't need anything else. I packed up the last of what I brought, double-checked the doors, and left without eating breakfast. I called the local sheriff's office when I got into town and reported it. Told them someone might be squatting in the cabin. They sent a deputy out later that week. He called me to say he found the tarp and cans in the attic, but nothing else. No one in the woods, no footprints, no vehicle. He said the sleeping bag was probably old, maybe had been up there a long time. Maybe even Mike, used it before he died. But I knew better. The food wasn't expired, the cigarette butts were fresh, and the man I saw in the woods was real. I wasn't imagining it. I never went back. A few months later, I sold the cabin to a couple from Connecticut, got a decent price, enough to close that chapter completely. Sometimes I still think about the attic, about how long he might have been living there. If he was there when I first walked in, watching from above, listening. But I don't let myself dwell on it. That part of my life is done. Mike is gone. The cabin is gone. I keep my doors locked now. I listen more closely when I hear things at night. And I don't go back to places that feel wrong. Not anymore. It was the second weekend of November 2019, and I decided to take a break from everything. I was 34, living in Tulsa, Oklahoma, working long hours as a mechanical technician at a small oil services company. Life had been stressful. My girlfriend had just broken things off a month earlier, and the days were starting to blend together. Work, home, eat, sleep, same thing every day. I needed to clear my head. So I packed my gear and headed out to a hunting cabin that my Uncle Tom had left me in his will 2 years earlier. It was deep in the woods near Clayton, Oklahoma. A small, old-fashioned, one-room wooden place with a tin roof, a hand-dug outhouse, no running water, and a wood stove for heat. No electricity, no cell service either, the kind of place people forget about. Perfect for hunting deer, but even better for being alone. I'd been there maybe 4 or 5 times since I inherited it. It was in the middle of nowhere. You had to drive 2 hours out of Tulsa, then another 45 minutes down a dirt road that was more potholes than road. After that, it was a 10-minute hike from where you had to park, since a big oak had fallen across the path years back, and I never bothered to clear it. I liked it that way. If it was harder to get to, less chance someone else would try to go near it. I left Friday morning around 10. Stopped in McAlester for some fuel and jerky, then made it to the trailhead a little after 1. I parked the truck under some tall pines, grabbed my backpack and rifle, and started hiking the trail in. It was damp from the rain a few days earlier, and the leaves had turned full orange and brown. I remember the air smelled clean. I like that about the woods. No smells of traffic or fried food or gas fumes. Just clean dirt, pine needles, and decaying leaves. When I got to the cabin, everything looked just like I left it. The place was dusty, cobwebs in the corners, but nothing broken. I always left a few things there. Some canned food, matches, a small propane burner, a few old wool blankets rolled up tight in a storage trunk, and my grandfather's old hatchet wedged in the chopping stump outside. The first thing I did was set up my cot by the back wall, then gathered some kindling to get a fire going in the stove. Even though the sun was still out, it was cold, probably in the high 30s. After warming the place a bit, I cracked open a can of chili, heated it on the stove, and ate straight from the can. I sat there for a while, just listening to the sounds outside. the wind moving the trees, a few birds now and then. No cars, no people, just silence. That first night was uneventful. I had the fire going, bundled up in 2 blankets on the cot, and just stared at the ceiling. I always had trouble sleeping my first night out in the cabin. Too quiet, maybe. Or maybe because I always felt a little exposed out there. The woods don't make a lot of noise, but when they do, it carries. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard a branch snap. It wasn't close, probably 30 yards off, but it was enough to make me sit up and listen. I held my breath for a second. Nothing. Then a few minutes later, another faint crack. Could have been a deer. Could have been a raccoon. I lay back down, still listening. Eventually, I must have fallen back asleep because when I opened my eyes again, it was light outside. Saturday morning, I was up before dawn, made some instant coffee on the burner and ate a cold granola bar, then put on my jacket, hat, and orange vest. I loaded up the .30-06 rifle and hiked out behind the cabin toward a ridge I'd scouted the year before. There was a shallow valley that deer liked to move through around daybreak. It was quiet out there, still a bit of mist hanging around the low spots. I sat against a tree with good cover about 100 feet up the slope where I could see down into the valley. I waited. An hour passed, nothing. Then too, around 8:30, I finally saw a buck, probably a 6-pointer. It moved low through the trees, stopping every few steps to sniff the air. I raised the rifle, waited until he stepped into the clearing, and pulled the trigger. The sound cracked through the woods like thunder. The deer flinched, staggered, then bolted. I knew I hit it, but probably not clean. I got up, heart racing, and followed the trail. I found blood on some leaves about 10 yards in, then more blood leading down through the brush. Took me nearly 40 minutes to find him. He was lying still beneath a small cedar, chest still rising and falling. I had to put him down with a second shot. After that, I sat there for a minute, just catching my breath. That part of hunting always felt heavy to me. You wait and wait. Then in 10 seconds, it's done. Life gone. I cleaned the deer where it fell and dragged it back uphill, tied the legs with some rope, and hung it from the game pole I'd set up behind the cabin years ago. My arms and lower back were already sore. It was just afternoon when I got back. I spent the next few hours cleaning up, salting the meat I could, wrapping what I wanted to bring back in cheesecloth. I didn't have a deep freezer out there, so most of it would have to go back with me Sunday. I kept the fire going and sharpened my knife on the porch step while watching the shadows grow longer. That night, things changed. I was lying in bed, still sore from dragging the deer and cleaning it, and I remember hearing something outside around 11. It was soft at first, like footsteps in leaves. Not animal sounds, more steady, more spaced out for steps, then a pause, then a few more. My body tensed up, eyes staring at the ceiling again, listening as hard as I could. I sat up slowly and looked at the stove. It was still glowing faintly, casting shadows on the wooden walls. The sound came again, closer. Someone was walking out there. I reached for my rifle and stayed still. No windows in the cabin had glass, just wooden shutters. I hadn't opened them that night, so I couldn't see out. I crept to the door and listened. The footsteps stopped. Dead silent. I waited. My mouth was dry. The silence stretched for maybe a minute. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of something brushing up against the side of the cabin. A light scrape like a jacket sleeve against wood. I felt something cold in my chest. I didn't open the door, didn't say a word. I just stayed there listening. My hand was wrapped tight around the rifle grip. Then the footsteps moved away slowly. Fewer leaves this time, lighter, then nothing. I waited another half hour before I dared lie back down. I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling till the fire died and the chill crept back in. When the sun came up, I went outside with the rifle. I looked around the perimeter of the cabin, scanning the ground. There were faint tracks, shoes, not boots. Regular sneakers, not mine. They came from the woods to the east, circled halfway around the cabin, then vanished back into the trees. No vehicle tracks anywhere on the trail. That whole morning, I kept checking over my shoulder. I didn't hunt. I didn't do anything except pace the edge of the clearing, looking out into the woods at trying to calm my nerves. By noon, I decided I wasn't staying another night. Something was off. I started packing everything up. I wrapped the meat in a tarp, cleaned up the cabin, and got everything in order. Around 3, I hiked the load back to the truck in 2 trips. Still no sign of anyone. Then I found it. When I got to my truck the second time, there was something stuck under the wiper blade. A piece of lined paper folded 3 times. I opened it up, hands shaking a little. It was blank, just a ripped out piece of notebook paper. No writing, no marks, just folded and tucked under the wiper. That's when my stomach dropped. Someone had been at my truck. I looked around the trees, nothing moved. The only sound was a crow calling out far in the distance. I loaded everything fast and slammed the tailgate shut. My eyes kept scanning the tree line. I got in and locked the doors immediately, started the engine, and drove. I didn't stop until I was back on the main highway heading north. Even now, years later, I think about that weekend more than I want to. I never went back to the cabin. I thought about selling it, but part of me wants to keep it. Like, I need to hold on to it for some reason I can't explain. I don't know who was out there. I don't know if it was some drifter, someone living off grid, or just a random person passing through, but whoever it was, they knew where I was. They got close to the cabin, they touched my truck, and they didn't take anything. They didn't break in, they didn't leave a threat. They just let me know they were there. Sometimes silence is scarier than words, and sometimes the woods are quieter because someone else is listening. I want to tell you about the worst weekend I ever spent in my life. It happened a few years ago in 2018 when I was 29. I had taken some time off work looking to escape the city and clear my head. I found a small cabin to rent in northern Minnesota near the border with Canada. I'd never been much for camping or the outdoors, but I figured a cabin would be safe enough. Just me, the woods, some quiet. What could go wrong? The cabin was out in the middle of nowhere, about a 2-hour drive from the closest town, and the road leading to it was little more than a rough gravel path. I remember driving there as the sun was starting to set, the sky fading from orange to dark blue. Trees lined the road on both sides, mostly pines and firs, thick and tall, so that soon I couldn't see much sky at all. The farther I went, the quieter everything got. No cars passed me, no sounds of civilization, just my own car and the steady crunch of gravel under the tires. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked older than the pictures online showed, but still decent. It was a small wooden 1-story with a tin roof, paint peeling off in places. The porch sagged a little on the right side, and a few windows were cracked. It sat on a slight hill, surrounded by thick woods that looked dark even in the fading light. I parked my car and unloaded my bags, feeling a strange mix of excitement and unease. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and damp earth, a smell I wasn't used to. The floorboards creaked under my feet. There was a small kitchen with a stove, a sink, and a fridge that hummed faintly. A table with 2 chairs sat near the window. The living room had a worn couch and a tiny TV with just a few channels. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom. I dumped my bags and started to unpack. I'd brought enough food for the weekend, mostly canned goods, some bread, peanut butter, and a small cooler with bottled water and soda. I hadn't planned to do much, just read, walk the trails nearby, and relax. I told a couple of friends about where I was going, but I wasn't planning to check in much. The cabin had no cell service or Wi-Fi, which I thought would be good. No distractions. That first night, I ate cold beans and crackers, then sat on the porch with a flashlight and a beer. The sky was clear, the stars bright, but the woods around the cabin felt alive. I kept hearing twigs snap, leaves rustle, but I told myself it was just animals. Deer, raccoons, birds settling in for the night. I had a baseball bat by the door, just in case. I went inside early, locked the door, and lay on the couch to read a book I'd brought. Around midnight, I heard something outside the window. A heavy thud against the cabin's side. My heart jumped. I sat still, straining to listen, then silence. I told myself it was a falling branch, maybe an animal knocking something over. I didn't want to let my imagination run wild. The next morning, I found scratch marks on the wooden wall just outside the window. Long, jagged gouges. They looked deep. I couldn't tell if an animal had done it or something else. I didn't feel like going outside much, but I needed firewood and some fresh air. I went down a narrow trail behind the cabin. The woods were thick, the sun barely filtering through the canopy. The air smelled wet, mossy. I collected some dead branches and logs to bring back. On the way, I noticed broken twigs, footprints, at least one set that looked too big to be a deer's. The prints were deep in the soft earth, and the shape wasn't like a bear's paw either. I felt a chill, but the logical part of me said it might be a large dog or a wild animal I wasn't familiar with. When I got back, I stacked the wood near the porch and lit a fire in the rusty old stove inside. The cabin warmed slowly, the flickering flames casting shadows on the walls. I cooked canned chili and ate alone. Later, I sat by the window, watching the woods darken again. That afternoon, I explored a bit more. There was a small lake about half a mile from the cabin. The water was still, reflecting the gray sky. I sat on a rock, skipping stones, feeling a little better, but then I noticed something strange on the opposite shore, something standing still between the trees. It was too dark to make out details, but it looked like a person, tall and thin. I blinked, but it didn't move. I felt uneasy and hurried back to the cabin, not looking back. Back inside, I locked the doors again. I tried to call my friends on my phone, but no signal. The cabin was completely cut off. I wanted to stay calm, remind myself it could be a hunter or someone else in the woods. Nothing dangerous. That night, around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of heavy footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. They stopped at the front door and paused for a long time. I could hear breathing. My skin felt cold and clammy. I grabbed the baseball bat and sat frozen, listening as the steps moved away. The silence after that was worse than the noise. I didn't sleep much after. I kept hearing noises, branches snapping, faint shuffling, whispers of movement. I thought about leaving right then, but the gravel road was a long drive in the dark, and I didn't want to risk getting lost or stuck somewhere. The next day I tried to explore again, but stayed closer to the cabin. I found strange marks carved into the trees around the clearing, lines and symbols like someone had been there recently. I didn't recognize them. I thought about calling the sheriff, but still had no phone service. I considered walking down the road to the nearest town, but I worried about being alone in the woods if someone was nearby. That afternoon, I spotted a vehicle parked far down the gravel road. An old pickup truck with rusted doors and faded paint. No one was in sight. It didn't seem like it had been there long. I kept my distance and went back to the cabin, feeling more trapped than ever. As evening came, I noticed that some food was missing from my supplies. Not a lot, but enough to know someone had been inside or close by while I was out. I double-checked all the locks and barricaded the windows with the old wooden shutters nailed to the walls. I moved the couch in front of the front door for extra protection. That night was the worst. I heard voices outside, low, angry, rough. I didn't understand what was being said, but the tone was threatening. I pressed myself against the wall, clutching the bat, heart pounding like a drum. The voices circled the cabin, the sounds carrying on the cold night air. Suddenly, something crashed against the side of the building, hard enough to shake the walls. I screamed in my head, but stayed silent, hoping they'd go away. More banging followed, pounding, heavy footsteps circling faster. Then, a loud crack. I realized one of the windows had been smashed. Cold night air and the smell of broken glass filled the cabin. I grabbed a knife I kept in the kitchen, trying to stay calm. I knew I had to be ready if whoever was out there came inside. I thought of all the horror stories you hear about people lost in the woods, but this was real, and I was terrified. The pounding stopped suddenly. Everything went quiet again, except for the occasional drip of water from the leaky roof. I stayed awake until dawn, watching the shattered window, waiting for the first light. When morning finally came, I didn't waste any time. I packed whatever I could carry and locked the cabin as best as I could. I kept my bat and knife close and started walking down the gravel road toward the town. It took me almost 2 hours to reach the first house, and I was shaking by the time I got there. I found a neighbor, a middle-aged man named Carl, who called the sheriff for me. The deputies came out with dogs and searched the woods, but they found no one. The truck I saw was gone, and there was no sign of recent visitors. I never went back to that cabin. I told the rental company about what happened, and they removed the listing from their site. They said they'd send someone to check on the place, but I never wanted to find out what was really going on. That weekend taught me how lonely and dangerous the woods can be. Not because of ghosts or monsters, but because of people. The fear I felt wasn't from some fairy tale. It was real. The quiet cabin in the middle of nowhere was not a refuge. It was a trap. I've never been the same since. Every time I hear a twig snap or a branch break outside, I remember that weekend. I learned to trust my instincts, to be cautious, and never to take silence for safety. The woods hold their own kind of terror, one you can't explain. And sometimes it's closer than you think. That's my story. I survived, but barely. And I hope you never have to spend a night like that. I grew up in a small town in Montana, not far from the Bitterroot Mountains. The land there was wide open and wild in parts, with endless fields of dry grass, sparse trees, and the occasional old farmstead left behind by families who moved on. My family had owned a small farm outside town for generations. By 1998, I was 27 and living in the city, but I still visited the farm whenever I could to help out or just to get away from the noise. I guess I always had a quiet place in my heart for that old land. That year, late September, I decided to spend a week at the cabin on the farm. The cabin wasn't really much more than an old weathered wooden house built sometime in the early 1900s. It sat near the edge of the property where the land sloped down into a thick patch of forest. The farm itself had been sold off piece by piece over the years, but the cabin and a few acres of land were still in the family. The place was always lonely but peaceful, surrounded by fields that stretched for miles and the occasional sound of wildlife. It was the perfect spot for me to clear my head. The drive out to the farm that September afternoon was long but calm. The sun was low in the sky, casting a warm orange glow across the land. I remember feeling that mix of excitement and unease as I turned off the main highway onto the gravel road that led to the cabin. The road was rough with deep ruts and loose stones winding between the tall grass and scraggly trees. I kept an eye out for deer or coyotes. Wild animals were common out here, especially near dusk. The cabin looked the same as I remembered. The faded red paint on the walls was peeling, and the windows were dusty and cracked in places. The roof sagged a little, and the porch creaked beneath my weight as I stepped onto it. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust, mixed with the faint scent of smoke from a fireplace that hadn't been used in months. The furniture was sparse. A small wooden table, 2 chairs, a battered couch, and a bed frame without a mattress. I'd brought my own sleeping bag and supplies, knowing the cabin had little to offer. That first evening, I started a fire in the stone hearth, using some dry kindling I found stacked in the shed nearby. The warmth of the fire was comforting against the chill that was settling in as the sun disappeared behind the hills. I sat close, watching the flames flicker and listening to the quiet sounds outside, the wind rustling the dry grass, the distant call of a coyote, the occasional snap of a twig. It was peaceful, but there was something in the stillness that felt heavy, like the land itself was holding its breath. As the night deepened, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the beam cutting through the dark like a knife. The sky was clear, filled with stars I hadn't seen in the city for years. The cool air smelled of earth and pine. I walked down the small hill behind the cabin toward the tree line. The woods were thick and dark, the trees standing tall and close together. I moved slowly, careful not to disturb any animals. That's when I first noticed it. The feeling that I wasn't alone. It was subtle at first, like a shadow just beyond the edge of my vision, a whisper of movement in the trees. I told myself it was just my imagination, the way the light played tricks on my eyes, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I kept my flashlight trained on the darkest spots, but I saw nothing except the occasional flicker of leaves in the breeze. I returned to the cabin, locking the door behind me. I double-checked the windows, making sure they were secure. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. Something about the night, the quiet that stretched on and on, felt wrong. I tried to focus on the fire, on the small comforts I'd brought with me, but the tension in my chest grew heavier. The next day was clear and cold. I spent it working around the farm, repairing the fence that had fallen, clearing brush, and checking the old water pump. The work helped distract me, and the sun was bright enough to chase away some of the shadows from the night before. I found an old shotgun in the cabin's storage closet, unused but in decent condition. I cleaned it carefully and decided to keep it close during the nights. That night, as the sun dipped again and the sky darkened, the unease returned stronger than before. Around dusk, I noticed something different. Tire tracks in the dirt road leading to the cabin. They were fresh, probably from the afternoon or early evening. I hadn't seen any cars all day, and the nearest neighbors were miles away. No one was supposed to be out here. I followed the tracks with my flashlight, careful not to leave the cabin grounds. The tracks ended about 50 yards down the road near a broken-down barn. The barn was old and dilapidated, wood gray and warped by decades of weather. I shone my light inside, but saw nothing. The door hung open on rusty hinges, creaking in the wind. The barn had been abandoned for years, used only by the occasional animal sheltering from storms. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I hurried back to the cabin, locking the doors again and sitting with the shotgun across my lap. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, making the branches scrape against the roof like nails on a chalkboard. Every sound was sharp and loud in the silence. I felt exposed, vulnerable. At one point during the night, I heard a noise outside. It was soft at first, a faint shuffling like footsteps on dry leaves. Then a low scraping sound, like someone dragging something heavy across the ground. I froze, gripping the shotgun tighter, trying to listen. The noises stopped suddenly, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed against the cabin walls. I stayed awake for hours, waiting for dawn. When the sun finally rose, I felt exhausted but relieved. I went outside to check the perimeter and found more tire tracks, fresh footprints near the edge of the woods, and some broken branches, as if someone had been moving through the trees. Whoever it was, they'd been close to the cabin during the night. The thought chilled me. I spent the next few days on edge, constantly watching the woods and the road. Each night, the noises came again. Footsteps, scratching, the distant sound of a vehicle starting up and driving away. During the days, I found signs that someone had been around. Cigarette butts, discarded cans, and a few pieces of torn fabric caught on the fence posts. Whoever was here wasn't passing through by accident. One afternoon, I found fresh tire tracks again, this time leading into the forest behind the cabin. They were rough, as if from a four-wheel drive or an old pickup truck. I decided to follow them cautiously. The trail twisted through the trees and climbed a steep ridge. After a while, I spotted a small clearing with an old campsite, charcoal from a fire, empty bottles, and some scattered trash. It looked like someone had been staying here for days, maybe weeks. The thought made my stomach twist. I wasn't alone out here. Someone was living in the woods near the cabin, watching, waiting. I went back to the cabin quickly and called the local sheriff from the landline. The phone rang several times, but no one answered. I tried again. Nothing. The nearest cell tower was miles away, and I didn't have a cell phone with me. I felt trapped. That night, I decided to pack up and leave. I didn't want to spend another night here, not knowing who was lurking in the woods. I loaded my things into my old pickup and prepared to drive back down the gravel road before it got too dark. Just as I was about to get in the truck, I heard a noise behind the cabin. A heavy thud, like someone slamming something against the wooden wall. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed the shotgun and circled the cabin slowly, shining my flashlight in every direction. In the faint moonlight, I saw footprints in the dirt, fresh and deep. They stopped just outside the porch. I could almost feel eyes on me. I climbed into the truck and locked the doors. As I started the engine, the headlights illuminated a figure standing at the edge of the tree line. A man, tall, wearing a dark jacket and jeans, his face hidden by a hood. He didn't move, just watched as I backed the truck down the driveway and sped toward the highway. I didn't look back. The drive down the gravel road was tense and nerve-wracking. Every shadow seemed alive. The headlights caught the glint of something metallic in the trees, a flashlight maybe. The engine rattled and I kept the shotgun across my lap, ready to defend myself if I had to. When I finally reached the highway and the safety of the main road, I slowed down and took a deep breath. The city lights in the distance felt like a blessing. I drove straight to the sheriff's office, explaining everything I'd seen and heard. They took me seriously and sent a deputy to check the farm and the surrounding woods. Weeks later, I heard from the sheriff that they had found evidence of squatters living near the farm, people who had been hiding out for months, possibly involved in criminal activity. The area was dangerous, and no one knew how long they had been watching the cabin. I never went back after that trip. The farm, once a place of quiet memories, had become something else, something darker, filled with the unknown. But at least I left before it was too late. I didn't plan on ending up in a cabin near a graveyard in the middle of nowhere. It just happened. In 2019, I was 34, living alone in Grand Junction, Colorado. I worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, and sometimes the walls of my apartment closed in on me. Too much quiet, too much screen time, not enough nature. That summer, I hit a point where I felt like I needed to step away. I wasn't burned out exactly, but I was sick of the same coffee shop, the same grocery store, the same everything. A buddy of mine, Nate, had told me about this off-grid cabin he used once while backpacking through the San Juans. He said it belonged to some old friend of his dad's, and no one really used it anymore. Nate said I could try staying there for a week if I needed to get away. I took him up on it. I didn't know what I was expecting. Something rustic, sure, but I didn't expect it to be directly across from a forgotten graveyard tucked between pine trees. The road that led to it was nothing more than a rutted dirt path overgrown on both sides with knee-high grass. It was clear no one had been down there in a while. It took me over 6 hours to drive from Grand Junction, then another hour on rough roads. By the time I got to the place, I was already questioning whether this had been a good idea. The cabin itself was old, but still standing strong, dark with siding, a steep roof, a crooked porch, and windows covered with metal shutters. There was a heavy padlock on the front door, but Nate had given me the key. Inside, it smelled like cedar and dust. I spent the first hour just airing it out. There was a small kitchen with a propane stove, a single bed with a thin mattress, and a wood-burning stove for heat. No electricity, no cell service. I brought a solar lantern, some dry food, a hand-crank radio, and a cooler full of stuff that would last a few days on ice. What I didn't know until I took a walk around the cabin was that it sat directly across from what looked like a century-old graveyard. No fence, no sign, just a few dozen headstones barely sticking up from the moss and grass. Most were weather-worn and hard to read, but a few dates popped out. 1896, 1911, 1923. It was eerie, sure, but not creepy in a haunted way. Just sad, forgotten. I figured I'd stay clear of it and keep to the woods behind the cabin. The first day passed quietly. I cooked a basic dinner on the propane stove, watched the trees move outside the windows, and read a book by lantern light until it got too dark to see anything else. I didn't sleep well that night. The forest was loud in a different way than I was used to. Every snap of a twig or rustle of a branch jolted me awake. Still, I chalked it up to being in a new place. By the second night, I was getting used to it. I had set up a little routine. Coffee over the stove in the morning, a hike through the woods during the day, lunch back at the cabin, reading or journaling in the afternoon, then dinner before it got dark. I hadn't seen a single person or car since I got there. No planes overhead, no distant dogs barking, just complete silence outside the sounds of nature. On the third night, around midnight, I heard what sounded like slow footsteps outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer, but the pace didn't feel right. Animals tend to move in bursts. This was slow and steady. Step, 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 then a pause, then again, step, step. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. There was no light switch to flip. I grabbed the lantern and lit it. I didn't move right away, just sat there listening. The footsteps stopped. I waited maybe 10 minutes, not hearing anything else. Then I opened the cabin door and stepped out onto the porch. Nothing, just darkness and trees. The graveyard was directly across the narrow dirt road, but with no moon, I couldn't see much past the closest stones. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe it had been a branch falling or some kind of animal shifting around. But from that moment on, I didn't feel alone anymore. The next day, I hiked up into the hills behind the cabin. I found an old trail that curved up along a ridge. There were signs of elk, tracks, droppings, but no animals in sight. On the way back down, I found what looked like an old hunting blind or shelter, mostly collapsed. Nearby was a rusted tin can with bullet holes in it and a few empty shell casings half buried in the dirt. They were .30-06, a hunting round. Not too weird for Colorado, but they looked old. That night, I kept the lantern by my bed and didn't sleep much. Around 3 a.m., I heard the footsteps again, this time circling the cabin. Step, step, shuffle, step. I stayed frozen in bed, staring at the ceiling. At one point, something brushed up against the cabin wall outside, like a shoulder or maybe a hand dragging along the wood. I didn't get up. I didn't open the door. I just waited for it to stop. By morning, I was starting to regret coming. I made a plan to leave the next day. I still had plenty of supplies, meth, and I wasn't hurt or in danger. Not exactly. But the place didn't feel empty anymore. Something was wrong, and I didn't want to wait around to figure it out. That afternoon, while packing my things, I walked back across the road to take a closer look at the graveyard. I figured before I left, I'd at least try to read some of the names and see if there was a story to the place. Most of the stones were unreadable, cracked or chipped by weather, but one large granite marker stood near the center, cleaner than the others. It read, Nathaniel Cross, 1860 to 1932. Sheriff died defending his home. The name hit me sideways. Nate, my friend who told me about the cabin, his full name was Nathaniel Cross Jr. He'd mentioned once that his family had roots in the area, but he never said anything more. That grave belonged to his great-grandfather. Suddenly, the story changed in my head. This wasn't just some random abandoned cabin. This was a family property with a graveyard out front and likely a history behind it that I didn't understand. I turned to leave the graveyard and stopped. There were fresh boot prints in the dirt. Not mine. They circled the area and led back into the woods across from the road. The prints were wide, heavy, maybe a size 12 or 13. Work boots. I followed them a few feet, but the ground got too dry and I lost the trail. Still, they hadn't been there yesterday. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the lantern on and sat in the chair by the window, staring out across the road. At one point, I saw movement between the trees, just the shape of a man walking slowly along the edge of the woods. He never looked at the cabin. He just passed by, heading deeper into the trees. I watched him for maybe 10 seconds before he vanished into the black. I left at dawn the next morning. The road out was just as rough going down, but I didn't care. I drove the rental SUV like I was being chased, scraping branches, bottoming out in the ruts. I made it back to Grand Junction by afternoon. When I returned the keys to Nate, I didn't say much. He asked how the trip went. I said it was peaceful, but I preferred camping a little closer to civilization. He laughed and said, "Fair enough." I didn't tell him about the footsteps or the boot prints or the man I saw walking between the trees, but I did look up some local history that night. I found a newspaper archive from the early 1930s. Sheriff Nathaniel Cross was killed during a shootout with bootleggers in the hills outside Silverton. The cabin had belonged to him. One of the men who killed him was never found. Some thought he vanished into the mountains and died there. Others believed he stayed close, hiding out in the forest for years after. The graveyard across from the cabin wasn't public. It was private, family members only. The last person buried there was in 1956. Since then, the land had fallen out of use. No one had maintained it. Nate probably didn't know the full history, or maybe he did and didn't want to bring it up. I never went back. I don't blame the cabin or the graveyard. I blame myself mostly for thinking I could isolate that deep in the woods and still feel safe. I never figured out who made those footsteps or who I saw in the trees. But I know what I saw, and it wasn't a ghost. It was a man, living or hiding or surviving out there. And that thought is what stays with me. I remember the exact moment I decided to take that trip, though I didn't know then how much it would haunt me later. I was 34 when I decided to take a break from everything. It was early November 2018. I had just quit a job that drained the life out of me every day. Felt like I hadn't truly rested in years. I lived in Helena, Montana, and after everything that had piled up that year, bills, stress, a failed relationship, I knew I needed to just get away from it all. I found a small cabin for rent on private property out in central Idaho, somewhere near McCall, but off the main roads, deep into the trees. It was a single-room wooden cabin with a fireplace, solar power, and a small propane heater as backup. There was a spring for water nearby and a shed with chopped wood. The pictures looked rustic, quiet, and perfect. The owner said cell signal wouldn't reach out there, but I didn't care. That was the whole point. I brought my dog with me. His name was Cooper. He was a 6-year-old golden retriever with a calm temperament. Though he always knew when something was off, I trusted that about him. He never barked without reason, never acted skittish unless there was something genuinely wrong. We got there on a Thursday afternoon. The drive took a while, about 8 hours through winding roads and dirt paths after we left the paved highway. My truck's GPS stopped working an hour before we arrived, and I had to rely on handwritten directions and a printed map. The cabin was tucked in a clearing about 300 yards from a small stream. The forest around it was thick, pine and fir trees all around with barely any underbrush, just brown needles and dead leaves carpeting the ground. There wasn't another house or person for miles. And that was just what I wanted. The place had no TV, no internet, no distractions. Just me, Cooper, and the woods. The first day went by quietly. I unpacked my gear, made a small fire inside, and fed Cooper. He sniffed around outside for a while, nose low to the ground, tail wagging lightly. At night, the temperature dropped hard. The wind made the trees creak, but the cabin held its warmth pretty well. I lay in bed with Cooper sleeping at my feet, listening to the sounds outside. It was peaceful. The next day, I woke up early to a cold, gray sky. There were no snowflakes, but I could smell it coming. I threw on my coat, boots, and gloves, grabbed my thermos, and took Cooper for a walk into the woods behind the cabin. The trees stood tall and silent. Cooper trotted ahead of me, occasionally stopping to sniff fallen branches or animal tracks. About a quarter-mile out, I found a small clearing. At the far end of it, I noticed something strange. A rusty metal pole sticking up out of the ground. It looked like a piece of an old fence post, or maybe part of an old gate, but it didn't match anything around it. There were no trails, no signs of an old road. I let Cooper sniff around it, but he didn't seem interested. I shrugged it off, and we headed back. That evening, something felt different. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing I could point to, just a strange sort of stillness. Cooper sat at the cabin door for a long time, staring out, his ears perked up like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. I asked him if he wanted to go outside, but he didn't move, just kept staring. Eventually, I opened the door and stepped out. The sky had darkened and I could smell pine sap thick in the air. Cooper didn't follow me out right away. He stepped out only after I walked several feet ahead. I didn't sleep well that night. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of crunching, like footsteps in dry leaves. I lay still in bed listening. At first, I thought it might just be deer or elk, but the pace of the steps was wrong. They were slow, steady, deliberate. Cooper stood up at the foot of the bed, ears back, staring at the wall. Then he growled, a low, deep growl that I had only heard from him a few times before. The sound stopped after about a minute, but I didn't sleep again. I kept the fire low and sat there in the dark, watching the shadows. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. No tracks, no signs of anyone or anything. It had frosted overnight, and the ground was stiff, so I would have seen prints if someone had been close. I tried to tell myself it had been a large animal or just wind knocking something over. Still, Cooper was on edge. Every little sound made him lift his head. He wouldn't leave my side. Later that afternoon, I went back to the clearing with the metal post. Something was off. The grass around it had been trampled, flattened in wide arcs like something had been walking in circles. The post was loose now, like it had been pulled and twisted. I tried to shake it, and it moved a little, but it was still deeply buried. There were broken sticks all around, snapped in strange patterns. I felt exposed out there, so I turned back quickly. That evening, as the sky dimmed, Cooper refused to go outside. He sat behind the door and stared again the same way he had the night before. His body was tense. The wind had picked up, and I could hear branches tapping against the roof. Then there was that same crunching sound again. I went to the window and turned off the lamp. Outside in the trees just beyond the clearing, I saw a shape. I couldn't tell if it was human. It was tall, maybe 6 feet or more, and it was standing just beyond the tree line, not moving, just there. I blinked and it was gone. I grabbed my flashlight, but I didn't go out. I locked the door, pulled the curtains, and sat down near the fireplace. Cooper was pressed against me. The wind held for hours that night. By the next morning, I had decided to leave early. I packed up my gear fast. The air was colder and a light snow had started to fall. Cooper was waiting at the truck before I even opened the door. I loaded up and started driving, but not 20 minutes down the trail, I realized I had left my phone behind. I had turned it off and stashed it in a drawer inside the cabin. I debated just leaving it, but it had everything on it. I couldn't risk it getting ruined or stolen. So I turned around. The snow was coming down harder now, covering the road and erasing my tire tracks. I pulled back into the clearing and parked, left the truck running. Cooper stayed in the passenger seat. I ran inside, found my phone in the drawer, and turned to leave. When I opened the door, I froze. There were fresh boot prints in the snow. Not mine, not Cooper's. They led from the trees at the edge of the clearing to the side of the cabin. Big, heavy prints, deep. Whoever made them had been wearing boots with a wide heel, and they hadn't been there when I pulled in. I stepped back inside and locked the door. My heart was hammering. I turned off the lights and crouched by the front window. Cooper was barking now, first standing up on his back. I watched the trees. Something moved between them. A man. I couldn't see much of his face, but I could see his clothes. Dark jacket, heavy pants, gloves. He moved slowly around the cabin toward the back. I heard a faint thump against the wall like he was testing the wood. I stayed still. I didn't have a gun with me, just a hatchet and a flare in my bag. I gripped the flare. Cooper growled, then barked again, loud, sharp, almost frantic. The man moved into view again, now only about 30 feet away. He was standing at the edge of the woods, watching the cabin. I didn't wait. I lit the flare and kicked the door open, screaming as loud as I could. I waved the flare high in the air. Cooper bolted out with me, barking like a mad dog. The man didn't run. He backed away slowly, step by step. Then he turned and vanished into the trees. I didn't even go back for the flare. I grabbed Cooper, threw him in the truck, and peeled out of that clearing. I didn't look back. I drove straight for the highway, not stopping once. When I got back to town, I called the local sheriff's office in Valley County. They said they'd send someone out to check the cabin. I never heard back. I didn't ask again. I never went back to Idaho. Sometimes I still wonder what that man was doing out there. If he lived in those woods, if he had been watching the cabin before I even arrived, the way he moved, the way he just stood there and watched, it wasn't right. I got lucky. Cooper saved me that night. If he hadn't barked, I might have opened the door without knowing anyone was out there, or worse, I might have stayed another night. I've gone camping since then, but never that far out. I learned something on that trip, something real and cold. It's not what you hear in the woods that should scare you. It's what you don't. It was the fall of 2006 when I decided to take a break from my life in Denver and rent a small cabin in the woods of northern Idaho. I was 29 then, working a job that left me tired and restless by the end of every week. The city noise, the constant rush, the endless buzz of people, it all made me crave a quiet place where I could think, breathe, and maybe just be alone for a while. I found a cabin listed online. Nothing fancy, just a small wooden building tucked in a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees about an hour's drive from the nearest small town. The pictures showed a porch with a couple of rocking chairs, a wood stove inside, and a small kitchen with just enough space for basic cooking. The rent was reasonable, and it was far from the chaos. Perfect, I thought. I packed my bags with the essentials: clothes, some canned food, a few books, my camera, and a basic first aid kit. I didn't expect to need much else. My car was packed the night before, and early the next morning, I hit the road. The drive itself was calming. The highway out of Denver gave way to smaller roads as I headed north, past farms, small towns, and then the thick forests of Idaho. The air grew cooler, and the scent of pine became stronger. I liked that smell, fresh, earthy, and clean. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low behind the hills. The road had narrowed to a dirt track by then, and my car kicked up dust as I drove the last few hundred yards. The cabin sat quietly in the clearing, looking exactly like the photos, simple and solid. A thin chimney poked from the roof, and I saw the stack of firewood neatly piled by the back door. I pulled up and turned off the engine. For a moment, all I could hear was the wind through the trees and the occasional bird call. No cars, no neighbors, no city noise. It was peaceful. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and something faintly sweet, maybe pine resin. The place was dusty, as if it hadn't been used for a while, but it was clean enough. There was a small table near the kitchen, a cot against the wall, and the wood stove stood cold in the corner. I set my bags down and started to unpack. I made a quick meal, a can of soup heated over a camping stove I had brought. Then I lit the wood stove with some kindling and dry logs. The fire came alive quickly, the warmth spreading through the room, casting flickering shadows on the walls. As night fell, I sat on the porch in one of the rocking chairs, wrapped in a blanket, staring up at the stars. They were brighter here, far from the city lights. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a faint ribbon of dust and light. It felt good to be alone. The first 2 days passed quietly. I explored the nearby woods during the day, walking along dirt trails, sometimes following animal tracks. I took pictures of the trees, the moss-covered rocks, and the occasional deer I spotted in the distance. I enjoyed the stillness and the rhythm of my own footsteps. At night, I made sure to keep the fire going. The woods were dark and thick. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves made me turn my head, my senses sharper than usual. But there was nothing there, only the quiet night sounds. On the third day, things started to feel different. I woke up before dawn and went outside to chop more firewood. The air was chilly and damp, and the forest was shrouded in mist. As I swung the axe into a fallen log, I thought I heard something, a distant snapping of branches like someone moving through the trees. But when I stopped and listened, there was nothing. I shook it off. Probably a deer or a raccoon. Back inside, I brewed some coffee on the stove and sat by the window, watching the mist lift from the ground. I noticed the small trail that led from the cabin deeper into the woods. It looked less traveled, the undergrowth closing in here and there. I decided I'd check it out later. By afternoon, the sun had broken through the clouds, and I grabbed my camera and set off down the trail. The woods were dense, the trees standing tall like silent guards. I felt a little thrill being so far from everything. No cell signal, no internet, no people. After walking for about an hour, the trail narrowed and I realized I was quite far from the cabin. The forest floor was littered with pine needles and dry leaves. The smell was strong here, earthy and wet. I paused to take some pictures of a fallen tree covered in moss and fungi. That's when I noticed it. A small, crude wooden cross tied with some old rope hanging from a low branch just a few feet off the path. It looked like it had been there for a while. I didn't know what to make of it. I stepped closer, examining it carefully. There was no writing or markings, just the rough wood tied together. A sudden unease crept into me, but I tried to reason it away. Maybe it was a memorial for a hunter or a lost pet. People sometimes left those in the woods. I took a picture and turned back toward the cabin, the feeling lingering. That night, the woods seemed louder. The wind rattled the windows, and every small noise inside the cabin made me jump. I kept the fire burning high and stayed awake longer than usual, staring into the flickering flames. Around midnight, I heard it clearly, a faint but steady noise outside, something scraping against the cabin's wooden walls. I froze. My heart thumped in my chest. I strained to listen. The noise stopped. Minutes passed, thick with silence. Then I heard it again from the back of the cabin this time. A slow, deliberate scraping sound like someone dragging something heavy or maybe scratching the wood. I grabbed the small flashlight from the table and crept to the back door, peeking out, but seeing only shadows and the swaying branches, nothing else. I tried not to let fear take hold. Probably an animal, maybe a bear or a raccoon searching for food, but the sound didn't quite match that. It was too deliberate. I locked all the doors and windows, then crawled into bed, clutching the blanket tightly. The next morning, I checked the back of the cabin. The wood near the door was scratched and gouged in several places, the marks fresh. Not deep cuts, but enough to show something had tried to claw or scrape the surface. I didn't know what to think. Over the next 2 days, I stayed mostly inside during the night. Each night, the noises grew more frequent. Scratches, footsteps crunching on dry leaves, soft thuds against the walls. One afternoon, while exploring a different trail, I found another cross, this one larger and tied to a tree near a clearing. Around it were scraps of cloth and some rusted cans. It looked like someone had camped here before, or maybe someone had been left behind. The thought made my stomach turn. I wanted to leave. I considered calling it off and driving back to Denver, but the nearest phone signal was miles away, and I wasn't sure what to do with this feeling creeping over me. An unshakable sense that I wasn't alone in those woods, that someone or something had been watching the cabin long before I arrived. On the 5th night, things came to a head. I had just settled into bed when I heard heavy footsteps outside. Not soft like before. Heavy, slow steps circling the cabin. I could hear the gravel crunch under the soles, the rustling of branches as someone moved carefully but steadily around the building. I wanted to hide, to run, but I was paralyzed. The footsteps stopped in front of the door. Then, a long pause. I held my breath. Then the sharp sound of something banging against the wood. Not a knock, more like a desperate, angry pounding. I grabbed the old hunting knife I kept in my backpack, trying to steady my shaking hands. The pounding stopped. I heard breathing outside. A deep, ragged breath, then the sound of someone running away, breaking through the bushes and crashing into the forest. I waited a long time before daring to move. When the sun rose, I checked the perimeter. There were footprints in the dirt, large, heavy boots circling the cabin, then vanishing into the woods. I packed my things quickly. On the drive back, my mind raced with questions. Who had been out there? How long had they been watching? Why had they disappeared so quickly after the pounding? I never found out. Back in the city, I told no one about what happened. I didn't want to sound paranoid or crazy. But I never forgot the look of those crosses in the woods, the way the footsteps circled the cabin, or the cold, heavy feeling of being watched. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I think about that cabin in Idaho, about the person or people who had been lurking in the shadows. I'm sure the forest holds more secrets than I'll ever know. In the fall of 2012, I took a week off from work to drive out to a small cabin in northeastern Arizona near the border with New Mexico. I was 29 at the time, and I had just gotten through a rough couple of months. I'd been laid off earlier that summer from a logistics company in San Diego and only recently found a new job. The stress of the transition had gotten to me, and I needed to clear my head before the new position started. A guy I knew from college, Brent, owned a patch of land out there with a basic cabin on it. He let me use it for free whenever I wanted, and I'd taken him up on the offer a few times over the years. He warned me not to stay longer than a few days, though. Said it got to people. I never asked what he meant. It was a 3-hour drive from Gallup. Once I turned off the highway and started working my way north on old county roads that were more dirt than pavement. The last 30 min took the most time. The land out there felt empty but not peaceful. Dry red dirt, scattered juniper trees, rocky hills, and old fences that didn't seem to keep anything or out. The sky was wide, the silence deeper than I remembered. The cabin sat about a quarter mile off a forgotten gravel road tucked into a shallow rise with a view of a dried-out arroyo that curled around to the west. It was one of those small one-room places. Probably no more than 20 by 20 feet with a metal roof, one window, and a deck that had seen better years. The inside was sparse. A cot, a table, a few chairs, a shelf with some old tools, a battery-powered lantern, and a wood stove that looked like it hadn't been used since Reagan was president. I parked the Jeep around back, unpacked my gear, and settled in. I brought food, water, a .38 revolver I usually kept in a safe at home, and some books I figured I'd finally get around to reading. I had my phone, but I wasn't expecting service. I wasn't disappointed. The first night passed quietly. I set up my sleeping bag on the cot, cooked a simple dinner of beans and rice over my small propane stove, and read until my eyes got heavy. I left the door open for a while, just watching the light drain from the sky. The sun slid down behind the distant hills, and the temperature dropped fast. I'd forgotten how cold the desert could get once the heat disappeared. I shut the door and turned on the lantern. By 9 p.m. I was out. I woke up around 2 in the morning. There was a sound I couldn't place. Not loud, just off. I lay there listening. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal scratching at the wall. It was softer, like something shifting weight outside. I reached over, pulled the revolver from my bag, and sat up slowly. My heart thudded in my chest, but nothing happened. I waited for 10, maybe 15 minutes. Eventually, I chalked it up to nerves. I hadn't been out in the middle of nowhere in a long time. You start hearing things out here. I set the gun on the floor beside me and went back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and did a slow circle around the cabin. I didn't see anything strange, just some coyote prints in the dust near the edge of the arroyo. That wasn't unusual. There were always animals moving around at night. Still, I felt uneasy. I went for a short hike after breakfast about 2 miles north where the land started to rise into low rocky ridges. There was an old windmill out that way that I remembered from a previous visit. The windmill was still there, rusted and silent. Nearby, I saw an old wooden post with a rusted loop of barbed wire dangling from it, half buried in dry weeds. Probably used to be a fence line. I sat there for a while and watched the clouds move. I didn't hear a plane, didn't see another human being, didn't pick up a single bar of cell service, just empty land in every direction. When I got back to the cabin around 2 p.m., something felt wrong. The door was still locked, but I noticed small indentations in the dirt just off the porch. They looked like footprints, but the shape wasn't right. They weren't barefoot, and they weren't from boots. The toes were too far apart. I bent down and took a photo with my phone, just in case, but it didn't come out clear. The shadows were wrong. That night, I kept the revolver close. Around midnight, I heard it again. The shifting sound, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a kind of clicking noise, almost like a dog's nails on hard ground. I turned off the lantern and sat there in the dark, listening. The sound moved slowly around the cabin, stopping now and then. At one point I heard it on the porch, creaking boards under weight. I didn't breathe. I waited, gun in hand, my mouth dry. After about 20 minutes, the sounds faded. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun rose, I stepped out cautiously and checked the porch. Dust had shifted around the entrance. There were smudges on the window as if something had pressed up against the glass with greasy hands or maybe a face. No prints, no clear sign of entry. Still, I felt watched. I told myself I was being paranoid, maybe letting isolation get to me. That afternoon, I drove 10 miles out to a bend in the road where I'd seen a house years ago. I thought maybe someone lived there, but when I arrived, the building was a burned-out shell. Nobody home. I kept driving until I got to a flat stretch with a view of the distant highway, then turned around. I was back by dusk. That third night was the worst. Started the same. The quiet, the cold, the dark. I tried to read, but my eyes kept flicking to the window. I turned the lantern off early, just sat there with the revolver in my lap. Around 11:30, I heard the porch creak again, not once, but multiple times. Something was moving back and forth slowly. Then came the worst sound I'd ever heard. Something trying the doorknob. Not forcing it, not slamming against it, just turning it back and forth slowly, like it was testing me, like it knew I was in there. My whole body locked up. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I wanted to shout, to scare it off, but something in my gut told me not to. I sat in that darkness for what felt like hours, waiting. At some point, the sound stopped. I didn't hear anything else that night. When morning came, I opened the door with the gun in both hands and scanned the area. Nothing, but the doorknob had fresh smudges on it, darker than the night before. I didn't even eat breakfast. I packed everything in under 10 minutes, threw my gear in the Jeep, and started back down the gravel road. I didn't care if it was early. I wanted out. But about 5 miles out, I noticed something in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, just shadows moving through the trees, but as I rounded a bend, I saw it again. Something stepping behind a tree line. Tall, thin, almost human in shape, but not quite. It wasn't wearing clothes. I couldn't make out a face. It moved too quickly. I drove faster. By the time I reached the highway, my hands were shaking. I didn't stop until I hit Gallup and parked at a gas station. I sat there for nearly an hour just breathing. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. I didn't even call Brent. The thing is, nothing supernatural happened. No ghosts, no monsters, but something was out there. Maybe it was a person. Maybe it was a predator. But it watched me, tested the cabin, circled me every night. That place had an emptiness to it. An old kind of silence that felt like it didn't want me there. Something walked that land, barefoot or not. And it wasn't just animals. I never went back to the cabin. A few months later, Brent sold the property. I didn't ask him why. I didn't want to know. I still think about those nights sometimes, especially when I wake up at 2 a.m. for no reason. I listen for the sound of weight shifting just outside the walls, and I never ever sleep with the door unlocked anymore. Whatever was out there didn't follow me, but I know this much for sure. I wasn't alone in that cabin, not even for a second. I was 32 when I decided to go back to that part of Tennessee. I hadn't been there in nearly 20 years. Life had moved on. I lived in Indiana by then, working as a mechanic at a small shop near Bloomington. I never talked much about my childhood, especially the time we lived near Monroe County before my dad got transferred to Georgia. But that fall, I had a week off work. And for reasons I still don't fully understand, I packed a small duffel bag, loaded up my old 2001 GMC Sierra, and drove south. The drive took about 5 hours. I took back roads for most of it, skipping the interstate. I guess I wanted the time to think. Leaves were just starting to turn. You could smell the cold starting to crawl into the air. I stopped once for gas and once for coffee and didn't speak to anyone besides the cashier. The closer I got to the old area, the quieter everything felt. My mind kept drifting back to one particular place from those years, the old cabin in the woods behind our neighborhood. We never knew who it belonged to. It had already been abandoned when I first found it with a neighbor kid back when I was maybe 10 or 11. My memory of it was fuzzy. Long, dark structure, boarded windows, roof half caved in on one side, and a rotting porch that gave under your weight if you weren't careful. The first time we found it, we ran off screaming when we heard what we thought was a raccoon or some animal inside. We never told our parents. We just kept going back, throwing rocks through the holes, daring each other to step further in. We stopped talking about it, and then we moved. That was the end of it, or so I thought. The road to the old neighborhood was still gravel. That surprised me. I figured it would have been paved by now. Some of the houses were gone, others looked worse for wear. I drove past the rusted gate where the neighborhood trail used to start. I parked just beyond that. No other cars in sight. It was about 4 in the afternoon, and the sun was starting to drop lower through the trees. I grabbed a flashlight from my glove box just in case and started walking. The trail was barely visible now, overgrown, scattered with branches and rocks. I hadn't brought hiking boots. It's just work boots, and they weren't great for climbing the hill. I remembered the whole forest had a stillness to it that set my nerves on edge. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of dead leaves underfoot. I was second-guessing the whole thing about halfway up the ridge, but I pushed forward. I didn't recognize anything until I saw the broken fence post that had been there 20 years ago. Gray, splintered, leaning like it was too tired to stand straight. Just beyond that, maybe 50 yards deeper into the woods, I saw the outline of the cabin. It was worse than I remembered. The roof was almost entirely collapsed now, except on the far right side. The front porch was missing entirely, just a few rotting beams sticking out of the ground. Most of the windows were broken. The whole structure looked like it would fall down if I sneezed too hard, but I walked toward it anyway. I don't know what I expected to find. Old furniture, animals, graffiti from kids who found it after me. I stepped through what was left of the door. It wasn't even on its hinges anymore. And into the main room smelled like mold and wet wood. The floor creaked under every step. There were broken pieces of furniture, what looked like a couch frame, an old cast iron stove with one leg bent in. The walls were dark with water stains. One corner had collapsed completely, and you could see the forest through the gap. There were stairs going up, barely holding together. I didn't trust them, so I stayed on the first floor and walked around slowly, looking at everything like I was in a museum. There were signs someone had been there more recently. Burnt-out fire pit in the fireplace, beer cans, some trash in a plastic bag. Maybe some teens had used it to party. Still, it felt wrong. The worst part was the silence. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the trees were leaning in too close, like the cabin was waiting for something. I was about to leave when I noticed a small door under the stairs. It was about 3 feet tall and wide enough to crawl through. I didn't remember it from before. It wasn't hidden, just easy to miss. I knelt down and tried to pull it open. It stuck for a second, then came loose with a groan. Behind it was a narrow dirt crawl space. The air that came out smelled like iron and rot. My flashlight beam bounced around the small space. First, I thought it was empty. Then I saw something in the far corner. A bundle of cloth, a sack. I crawled in. My back scraped the ceiling. The ground was uneven and damp. The thing in the corner was wrapped in canvas. When I reached it, I saw that it wasn't just one thing. It was a pile of objects. First thing I noticed was a pair of boots, old leather, cracked, still laced. Next to them, a rusted lantern. Then I saw the jacket bunched up under the sack. It had a patch on the shoulder, Tennessee Forestry Service. I froze. I remembered then, years ago there had been rumors a ranger had gone missing in this area, supposedly out checking fire lines, and never came back. I didn't think much of it back then. I was a kid. But now, seeing this, something clicked. I backed out fast. I didn't touch anything else. My heart was pounding. Once I was out, I stood up and took a deep breath. I tried to tell myself it didn't mean anything. Could have been a squatter. Could have been someone who just left their gear. But that didn't explain the stink or the way the air felt back there. It didn't explain the way everything in my gut screamed to get the hell out. I started walking back toward the trail. That's when I saw the tracks. They weren't boot prints. They were bare feet, human, fresh. The leaves had been disturbed and the dirt was pressed down like someone had walked through recently. The prints circled the cabin around the side near where I had come in. They weren't there when I arrived. I didn't wait. I jogged back toward the road, flashlight still in hand. Every shadow looked like a person. Every snap of a branch made me flinch. I didn't stop until I saw my truck. I got in, locked the doors, and sat there for a few minutes with the engine off, trying to calm down. I didn't call the police right away. I drove back to the nearest gas station about 15 miles out and used their payphone. Told the sheriff's office I found something weird near a cabin in the woods. Gave them vague directions. Didn't leave my name. I didn't want to get dragged into something. I just wanted to be done with it. I drove back home the next morning. For a while I kept checking the news. Nothing came up. No missing ranger stories. No discovery in the woods. Maybe they didn't go out there. Maybe they didn't find it. Maybe they did and didn't say anything. I never went back. I told myself I imagined